Sword Beach, Normandy, June 6, 1944, 0630 hours, and Unteroffizier Klaus Hoffman of the 716th Static Infantry Division was peering through his MG-42 machine gun sight at what appeared to be canvas boats approaching through the morning mist, when suddenly one of them collapsed like a circus tent and revealed a fully operational Sherman tank that immediately opened fire with its 75mm gun, sending a high-explosive shell directly into his concrete bunker that killed 3 of his comrades instantly and left him wondering if he had lost his mind, because tanks do not swim, tanks cannot swim, tanks have never been able to swim, yet here they were, emerging from the English Channel like steel sea monsters with Allied invasion markings. And this was the moment Germany discovered that the impossible had become possible through a secret Allied weapon called the DD Sherman, or Duplex Drive tank, that would help turn June 6th into the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. The story of Germany's shock at encountering swimming Sherman tanks actually begins not on D-Day itself, but in 1941 when a Hungarian inventor named Nicholas Strasser working for the British developed a revolutionary flotation system that could make a 33-ton tank float and swim to shore, using a collapsible canvas screen supported by 36 rubber tubes inflated with compressed air, creating what looked like a canvas boat but was actually a fully armed Sherman tank capable of traveling at 4 to 5 knots through ocean waves. And the Germans had absolutely no intelligence about this weapon system despite their extensive spy networks, their aerial reconnaissance, and their confidence that they knew every piece of Allied equipment that would be used in the invasion they knew was coming. The German High Command had spent years preparing for the Allied invasion, with Field Marshal Erwin Rommel personally inspecting every meter of the Atlantic Wall, installing millions of mines, thousands of concrete bunkers, hundreds of artillery positions, and creating what they believed was an impregnable fortress along the French coast. But not once in all their planning sessions, all their war games, all their defensive preparations did anyone suggest that Allied tanks might simply swim ashore ahead of the infantry, because the concept was so revolutionary, so unexpected, that it never entered their calculations, and this oversight would prove catastrophic on June 6 when 741 DD Sherman tanks were scheduled to spearhead the Allied assault on 5 invasion beaches. At German 7th Army headquarters in Le Mans, General Friedrich Dahlmann had scheduled a map exercise for June 6 to practice responses to an Allied invasion, ironically pulling many divisional commanders away from their posts on the actual day of invasion, while Field Marshal Rommel himself had left France on June 5 to celebrate his wife's birthday in Germany, convinced that the bad weather made an immediate invasion unlikely, and even Adolf Hitler was sleeping late at his Berghof residence in Bavaria with standing orders that he was not to be awakened for any reason, which meant that when reports started arriving of tanks emerging from the sea at dawn, the German command structure was paralyzed, unable to comprehend what was happening or respond effectively to this unprecedented threat. The British had produced 693 Sherman DD tanks by June 1944, converting M4A2 and M4A4 models at workshops across England, while the Americans had delivered 348 DD Shermans built exclusively from M4A1 variants, and these 1,000-plus amphibious tanks had been training in absolute secrecy at places like Camp MacDivitt near Torcross in Devon, where Major William Duncan commanded the U.S. DD Tank School, teaching crews how to erect the canvas screen in 15 minutes, how to navigate using a compass and tiller while standing on a platform behind the turret, how to engage the twin propellers driven by the tank's tracks, and most importantly, how to drop the screen in seconds once they reached shallow water and transform instantly from a swimming vehicle into a combat tank. The training had been intensive and dangerous, with crews first learning basic techniques at Fritton Lake on the Norfolk-Suffolk border, practicing launching from mock landing craft tank ramps, before moving to Stokes Bay at Gosport for 3 weeks of training in actual ocean conditions, and the importance of this training became tragically clear during Exercise Tiger on April 28, 1944, when German E-boats attacked a practice landing at Slapton Sands, killing over 1,000 American servicemen in a disaster that remained classified for decades, partly because several DD tank crews drowned when their vehicles sank during the chaos, highlighting just how vulnerable these swimming tanks were to rough seas and enemy action. The DD Sherman's flotation system was ingeniously simple yet incredibly fragile, consisting of a boat-shaped mild steel platform welded to the tank's hull, to which was attached a heavy rubberized canvas screen that when erected stood 7 feet tall enough to displace sufficient water to float a 30-ton tank, with the screen held rigid by those 36 vertical rubber tubes inflated by compressed air bottles, and horizontal metal hoops that could be locked in place, creating what essentially looked like a canvas boat with about 3 feet of freeboard, just enough to handle moderate ocean swells but dangerously inadequate in rough seas, which is exactly what many DD tanks would encounter on D-Day. The propulsion system was equally clever, with two 26-inch diameter propellers mounted at the rear of the tank, driven not by a separate engine but by the tank's own tracks through a power takeoff system, allowing the DD Sherman to achieve speeds of 4 to 5 knots in calm water, though steering required both the driver operating hydraulic controls to swivel the propellers and the commander standing on his precarious platform behind the turret, exposed to enemy fire and ocean spray, wrestling with a large tiller while trying to navigate using a basic compass, all while knowing that a single tear in the canvas screen larger than 1 foot could send the entire tank and its 5-man crew straight to the bottom of the English Channel. The Germans had actually experimented with their own amphibious tanks years earlier, developing the Tauchpanzer or diving tank for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, which involved waterproofing Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs and fitting them with snorkels so they could drive along the seabed. But this concept was completely different from the Allied approach of making tanks float, and after Sea Lion was cancelled, the Germans abandoned amphibious tank development, focusing instead on conventional armored warfare, never imagining that the Allies would succeed where they had stopped trying, never suspecting that on D-Day they would face tanks that could swim. Colonel Hermann von Appeln-Bronikowski, commander of the 22nd Panzer Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, was one of the most experienced tank commanders in the Wehrmacht, a veteran of Poland, France, and Russia, known for his tactical brilliance and his legendary ability to survive direct hits on his tank, having walked away unscathed from 3 different occasions when his panzer was destroyed in combat, and on June 6 he would lead the only German armored counterattack against the D-Day beaches, but even he, with all his experience, was completely unprepared for the reports that started reaching him that morning of Allied tanks rising from the sea. The 21st Panzer Division was positioned inland from Cannes, the only German armored division within immediate striking distance of the invasion beaches, with 98 Panzer IV tanks and 6 Panzer IVs mounting short-barreled guns, plus various support vehicles, and when the first reports of Allied landings reached Divisional Commander General Lieutenant Edgar Feuchtinger at 0200 hours, he immediately wanted to attack, but he couldn't, because the division was under direct control of OKW, Hitler's headquarters, and without Hitler's personal permission, which wouldn't come until noon because Hitler was sleeping, the tanks had to sit idle while Allied forces poured ashore, including those swimming DD Shermans that nobody in the German command structure could quite believe were real. At Sword Beach, the easternmost British landing zone, the DD tanks of the 13th/18th Royal Hussars launched at 0540 hours from their LCTs positioned 5,000 yards offshore, in moderate seas with 3-foot waves, and 31 of 34 tanks successfully made the swim to the beach, their canvas screens barely visible above the waterline, looking to German defenders like oversized rowboats, in the words of one survivor, until they reached shallow water at approximately 0725 hours and suddenly collapsed their screens to reveal fully operational Sherman tanks that immediately opened fire on German positions while still in the surf, providing crucial fire support for the infantry landing behind them. The psychological impact on German defenders was devastating, as Oberstfreiter Wilhelm Müller of the 736th Grenadier Regiment later testified in a prisoner interrogation, describing how his unit had been manning their positions since 0400 hours, watching for landing craft prepared for infantry assault, when suddenly what they thought were supply rafts or rubber boats transformed into tanks, and the MG-42 machine gun rounds that would have slaughtered infantry bounced harmlessly off Sherman armor, while the tank's 75mm guns and coaxial machine guns systematically destroyed one German position after another, and Müller admitted that several men in his bunker simply stopped fighting, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. At Gold Beach, where the sea conditions were rougher, the Nottinghamshire Yeomanry's DD tanks were launched only 700 yards from shore, but still 8 tanks were lost on the approach, their screens collapsing under the pounding waves, crews desperately trying to escape through the hatches as 30 tons of steel plummeted toward the seabed, while the survivors reached the beach to find that Sherman Crab flail tanks, another of Major General Percy Hobart's specialized vehicles known as Hobart's Funnies, had already cleared paths through the minefields and destroyed many of the German gun positions that the DD tanks were supposed to suppress, showing how the entire specialized armor concept worked as an integrated system. The 4th/7th Royal Dragoon Guards at Gold Beach made a different decision when their commanders saw the rough seas, choosing to land their DD tanks directly on the beach with screens still erected, driving up through the surf like bizarre sailing vessels until they could lower their screens on dry land. And while this meant they didn't provide the early fire support that swimming tanks were supposed to deliver, it also meant they didn't lose any tanks to drowning, a pragmatic decision that highlighted the constant balance between tactical doctrine and battlefield reality that characterized the use of DD tanks on D-Day. At Juno Beach, where Canadian forces were landing, the Fort Garry Horse Regiment equipped with DD Shermans couldn't launch at all due to sea conditions. But the 1st Hussars managed to launch their tanks from 5,000 yards out, and 21 of 29 successfully reached the beach, where they engaged German strongpoints including concrete casemates housing 88mm guns, the feared ACT, that could penetrate Sherman armor at 2,000 yards. But the DD tanks had achieved tactical surprise, hitting the German positions before they were fully manned, and Canadian tanks destroyed several key bunkers in the first 30 minutes of the assault. Utah Beach, the westernmost American landing zone, saw the 70th Tank Battalion launch their DD Shermans from only 1,000 yards offshore, 15 minutes behind schedule, and 27 of 28 tanks successfully reached the beach, though confusion caused by smoke screens meant they landed 2,000 yards from their intended position, but this actually worked to their advantage as they avoided the strongest German defenses and were able to support the infantry advance inland, with DD tanks accompanying the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Infantry Regiment as they moved toward Exit 2 from the beach, though congestion formed when an 88mm anti-tank gun and a blown bridge blocked the causeway. But it was at Omaha Beach that the DD Sherman concept met disaster, where the 741st Tank Battalion launched 29 tanks from 6,000 yards offshore into 5 to 6 foot seas with strong cross currents, conditions far exceeding the Force 3 maximum that Major William Duncan had specified in his top-secret report as the absolute limit for DD operations, and within minutes tanks started sinking, their screens collapsing under the massive waves. And of the 29 tanks launched, 27 sank in the channel, with only 2 tanks commanded by Sergeant George Geddes and Sergeant Turner Shepard making it to shore, while the 743rd Tank Battalion, scheduled to swim in alongside them, wisely decided to beach land their DD tanks instead. The tragedy of the 741st Tank Battalion revealed the fundamental vulnerability of the DD Sherman concept, as investigations later showed that the tanks had been launched perpendicular to the waves, causing water to crash over the screens from the side, and that many crews had never trained in conditions remotely approaching what they faced on D-Day, with most training done in calm lakes or protected bays, not in the open ocean with strong currents and enemy fire, and while some crews managed to escape their sinking tanks using the Davis submerged escape apparatus they had been trained with, others drowned trapped inside their vehicles, their bodies never recovered from the channel floor. The German reaction to the DD tanks that did make it ashore was a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and tactical paralysis, as evidenced by the experience of the 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha Beach, an elite unit with extensive combat experience, whose after-action reports described defenders calling for anti-tank guns to engage swimming tanks, only to be told by skeptical officers that no such thing existed, that the observers must be seeing things, that panic was causing hallucinations, until multiple positions reported the same impossible sight and commanders realized they were facing a weapon system they had never trained to counter, never developed tactics to defeat, never even imagined could exist. Meanwhile, at German High Command, the reports of swimming tanks were initially dismissed as panic-driven exaggeration from troops under stress, with one staff officer at 7th Army Headquarters allegedly saying, "If tanks could swim, why would anyone build landing craft?" A logical question that shows how completely the DD Sherman had achieved tactical surprise, and it wasn't until photographic evidence and multiple corroborating reports arrived that the German command structure accepted that the Allies had indeed developed amphibious tanks, by which time hundreds of DD Shermans were already ashore and advancing inland, their mission of achieving surprise and providing early fire support largely accomplished despite the losses. The story of how Germany failed to detect the DD Sherman program despite extensive intelligence efforts is remarkable, considering that over 1,000 tanks had been converted, thousands of crew members trained, and major exercises conducted including the disastrous Exercise Tiger. Yet German intelligence never learned about this capability, partly due to exceptional Allied security that designated the DD program bigot, a classification above top secret, restricting knowledge to the absolute minimum number of personnel, and partly because the Germans simply couldn't conceive of such a weapon, with their technical experts focused on improving armor and firepower rather than amphibious capability. When Field Marshal Rommel finally returned to his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon Castle at 2200 hours on June 6, after a frantic drive from Germany, he received a comprehensive briefing on the day's disasters, including the presence of swimming tanks at 4 of the 5 invasion beaches, and witnesses reported that the Desert Fox, usually quick to grasp new tactical situations, struggled to understand how tanks could float, repeatedly asking technical questions about displacement and flotation that his staff couldn't answer, because nobody in the German military had seriously studied the possibility of making a 30-ton tank swim. General Erich Marx, commander of 84 Corps responsible for the Normandy coastal defenses, had told Colonel von Appeln-Bronikowski before his counterattack on June 6, "If you don't succeed in throwing the British into the sea, we shall have lost the war." But Marx didn't know about the DD tanks when he said this, didn't know that British armor was already establishing positions on Purriers Ridge, didn't know that his carefully planned defensive system had been compromised by swimming tanks that bypassed beach obstacles and provided immediate fire support to attacking infantry, making the German counterattack more difficult and ultimately futile. The 21st Panzer Division's counterattack finally began at 1600 hours on June 6, after spending the entire morning trying to get permission to move, then navigating through Cannes bomb-damaged streets because Allied air superiority made the direct route suicidal. And when von Appeln-Bronikowski's tanks finally reached the British positions on Purriers Ridge, they drove straight into a carefully prepared killing ground where the 2nd Battalion King's Shropshire Light Infantry had positioned 6-pounder anti-tank guns, Sherman Firefly tanks mounting 17-pounder guns, and self-propelled artillery, and in 10 minutes of devastating fire, 16 of von Appeln-Bronikowski's Panzer IVs were burning wrecks. The presence of DD tanks on the beaches had allowed Allied forces to establish anti-tank defenses much faster than German doctrine anticipated, because instead of waiting hours for tanks to be unloaded from landing craft under fire, the Allies had armor support within minutes of the first infantry wave, fundamentally changing the dynamics of amphibious assault. And while the 21st Panzer Division did manage to push some units through to the coast between the British and Canadian beaches, they were forced to withdraw when 250 gliders of the British 6th Airborne Division flew overhead at 2100 hours, causing German commanders to fear they were being surrounded by airborne forces. Major Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote in his memoirs about the confusion and frustration of June 6, describing how every assumption about Allied capabilities had been wrong, how the appearance of swimming tanks had turned military logic upside down, and how the German response was paralyzed by disbelief and indecision, with precious hours wasted arguing about whether the reports were accurate instead of responding to the actual threat. And von Luck admitted that even if they had known about DD tanks in advance, the German military probably wouldn't have developed effective countermeasures because the concept was so foreign to their tactical thinking. The technical achievement of the DD Sherman was remarkable for 1944, as the canvas screen and flotation system added only minimal weight to the tank while providing enough buoyancy to float 33 tons. The compressed air system could inflate all 36 rubber tubes simultaneously in minutes. The propeller drive system ingeniously used existing mechanical components rather than requiring a separate engine, and the entire apparatus could be jettisoned in combat if damaged, allowing the tank to function normally, though most crews tried to preserve the equipment for future operations, with some DD tanks participating in multiple amphibious assaults after D-Day. The British had spent months perfecting the DD Sherman design, with initial tests using Valentine tanks proving the concept could work, but the Valentine was obsolete by 1944, so the system was adapted to the Sherman, with 293 M4A2 Sherman 3 tanks and 400 M4A4 Sherman V tanks converted in British workshops, while the Americans focused exclusively on M4A1 conversions, and the differences between these variants affected performance with the longer M4A4, providing slightly better freeboard when swimming, while the cast hull M4A1 had what some engineers called superior hydrodynamic properties, though in practice all variants were equally vulnerable to rough seas. Training for DD tank crews was extensive and dangerous, beginning at Fritton Lake where crews learned basic waterproofing techniques, how to use the Davis escape apparatus in case their tank sank, how to maintain the delicate canvas screen, how to operate the inflation system, how to engage and disengage the propeller drive, before progressing to ocean training where they practiced launching from actual LCTs, swimming in formation, navigating by compass, and transitioning from swimming to Combat mode on beaches, with British and Canadian crews averaging 6 weeks of specialized training, while American crews sometimes received as little as 2 weeks due to time constraints. The German defenders at Strong Point WN62 overlooking Omaha Beach, one of the most fortified positions on the entire Atlantic Wall, reported seeing what they initially thought were barges or rafts approaching through the early morning mist, until one of these vessels suddenly seemed to collapse and a Sherman tank emerged, its gun immediately engaging German positions, and while this particular tank was likely one of the only 2 from the 741st Tank Battalion to successfully swim ashore, its presence caused such confusion that defenders temporarily stopped firing, trying to understand what they were seeing, giving precious seconds for American infantry to advance up the beach. Unteroffizier Kurt Meyer of the 716th Static Infantry Division, not to be confused with the SS commander of the same name, was manning an observation post above Sword Beach when the first DD tanks arrived, and in his post-war account he described the moment of recognition when what appeared to be floating boxes suddenly revealed themselves as tanks, the psychological shock of seeing something that violated everything he understood about armored warfare, and how this shock turned to fear when he realized these swimming tanks were not some desperate improvisation but purpose-built weapons, manufactured in numbers with trained crews, representing a level of Allied technological capability that Germany had completely failed to anticipate. The success rate of DD tanks varied dramatically across the 5 invasion beaches, from the 96% success of the 70th Tank Battalion at Utah Beach, where they launched from only 1,000 yards in relatively calm seas, to the catastrophic 7% success rate of the 741st Tank Battalion at Omaha Beach, where they launched from 6,000 yards in heavy seas, but even where most tanks sank, the very presence of some DD tanks reaching shore had disproportionate psychological impact, convincing German defenders that they faced an enemy with seemingly impossible technological advantages, contributing to the breakdown of coordinated defense. The role of weather in the DD tank story cannot be understated, as the Allied meteorologists had identified a brief break in the storm starting midnight June 5th and continuing through June 6th, a window that German meteorologists missed, leading German commanders to believe invasion was impossible, which is why so many were absent from their posts. But this same rough weather that provided strategic surprise also created the hazardous sea conditions that sank so many DD tanks, particularly American tanks launched at maximum range, showing how the same environmental factor could be both advantageous and catastrophic simultaneously. Lieutenant Dean Rockwell, commanding U.S. Navy LCT Group 35, had trained extensively with DD tank battalions and knew the limitations of the system, which is why he strongly urged Army commanders on D-Day morning to reconsider launching in the rough seas. But the decision was left to individual Army captains commanding each battalion, and while Captain Ned Elder of the 743rd Tank Battalion's Company C wisely chose to beach land his tanks, Captain James Thornton of the 741st Tank Battalion's Company B and Captain Charles Young of Company C chose to launch, decisions that cost 27 tanks and many lives, highlighting the terrible burden of command in warfare. The aftermath of D-Day saw German intelligence frantically trying to understand the DD Sherman technology, with captured examples examined by technical experts who marveled at the simplicity of the design while recognizing its revolutionary impact, and Wehrmacht reports from late June 1944 describe efforts to develop countermeasures, including proposals for specialized ammunition to puncture flotation screens at long range, magnetic mines to be placed in shallow water, and even their own swimming tanks, but none of these proposals were implemented before the German army was driven from Normandy, and the DD Sherman had already accomplished its mission of helping establish the Allied beachhead. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend arrived in Normandy on June 7th, too late to influence the D-Day battle but in time to hear accounts from survivors about the swimming tanks, and these teenage soldiers, indoctrinated to believe in German technological superiority, struggled to accept that the Allies had deployed a weapon system Germany hadn't even imagined, with one young SS trooper allegedly asking his sergeant, "If they can make tanks swim, what else can they do that we don't know about?" A question that revealed the deeper impact of the DD Sherman on German morale, creating doubt about their entire understanding of Allied capabilities. Major Alfred Becker, commanding the 200th Assault Gun Battalion of the 21st Panzer Division, had spent months before D-Day converting captured French vehicles into improvised fighting vehicles, creating the famous Becker's Funnies that included self-propelled guns on French chassis, showing German mechanical ingenuity, But even Becker admitted after the war that he never conceived of making tanks amphibious, that the German military mind was focused on firepower and armor rather than mobility and surprise, and that the DD Sherman represented a completely different philosophy of armored warfare that Germany failed to anticipate or counter. The story of the DD Sherman's impact goes beyond the tactical success or failure on individual beaches, as the very existence of swimming tanks forced German commanders to reconsider every assumption about Allied capabilities, creating uncertainty and hesitation that plagued German decision-making throughout the Normandy campaign, with commanders constantly wondering what other secret weapons the Allies might deploy, what other impossible technologies might suddenly appear, turning every Allied attack into a potential revelation of some new war-winning weapon, paralyzing German response with indecision and doubt. On June 7, as German reinforcements moved toward Normandy, they received briefings about the swimming tanks and other specialized armor they would face, including Sherman crab flail tanks for clearing minefields, Churchill AVRE tanks with petard mortars for destroying bunkers, Churchill crocodile flame-throwing tanks, armored ramp carriers for crossing obstacles, and the various other innovations of Hobart's 79th Armored Division, and many German officers later reported that this briefing was deeply demoralizing, making them feel they were fighting an enemy with unlimited technological resources while Germany struggled to maintain its existing equipment. The Japanese military attaché in Berlin, reviewing German reports about D-Day, noted with interest the Allied use of swimming tanks, comparing them to Japan's own amphibious tanks like the Type 2 Kami, which had been used at Saipan and other Pacific battles, though the Japanese design philosophy was completely different, using detachable pontoons rather than collapsible screens, and designed for tropical island warfare rather than the cold waters of the English Channel. But the Japanese recognized the strategic importance of amphibious armor and warned that American forces would likely deploy similar weapons in the Pacific, though by then Japan lacked the industrial capacity to respond. Italian military observers, whose forces had faced Allied landings at Sicily and Salerno, reviewed German reports about DD tanks with resignation, noting that Italy had never developed amphibious armor despite its extensive coastline and vulnerability to amphibious assault, with one Italian general reportedly commenting that the swimming Sherman was the perfect weapon for the war Italy was fighting, a war of defending coastal positions against Allied naval supremacy. But Italy's limited industrial capacity and lack of technical expertise meant they could only watch as their German allies struggled to counter a weapon Italy could never have produced. The Soviet military mission in London, which had been secretly briefed on DD tank capabilities as part of Allied cooperation, showed little interest in the technology, as the Eastern Front offered few opportunities for amphibious operations, and Soviet tank doctrine emphasized mass production of simple, reliable vehicles like the T-34 rather than specialized variants, though Soviet engineers did note the ingenious use of existing mechanical systems to power the propellers, a design philosophy they appreciated, and after the war the Soviets would develop their own amphibious tanks using lessons learned from studying captured DD Shermans. Back in England, at Camp MacDivitt where so many DD tank crews had trained, instructors were already incorporating lessons learned from D-Day into their training program, teaching crews to better judge sea conditions, to launch at closer ranges when possible, to maintain formation while swimming to provide mutual support, and most importantly, to make independent decisions based on actual conditions rather than rigid adherence to doctrine, lessons that would be applied when DD tanks were used. Again for crossing the Rhine River and other water obstacles as the Allies advanced into Germany. The preservation of DD tank technology after D-Day shows its perceived value, as most specialized D-Day equipment was considered expendable, but DD crews were instructed to preserve their flotation gear whenever possible, and many tanks that swam ashore on June 6 still had their screens intact weeks later, ready for future amphibious operations, though the system was so maintenance-intensive that special workshops had to be established to repair and maintain the delicate canvas screens and rubber tubes, with British engineers developing improved versions throughout the campaign, including the Mark II DD with reinforced screens and better pumps. The German propaganda ministry struggled to explain the presence of swimming tanks to the German public, initially claiming they were a desperate Allied improvisation that proved the invasion was failing, then later arguing they were ineffective wonder weapons that showed Allied technological confusion. But frontline soldiers knew better, knew that these swimming tanks had achieved complete tactical surprise, had provided crucial fire support at the most vulnerable moment of the invasion, and had contributed to establishing the beachhead that would ultimately lead to Germany's defeat, making the DD Sherman not just a technical curiosity but a weapon that changed history. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, the architect of German blitzkrieg tactics and Inspector General of Panzer Forces, reviewed reports about DD tanks with professional interest, recognizing the innovation while questioning its practical value, arguing that Germany's focus on heavy tanks like the Tiger and Panther was strategically correct, that specialized amphibious tanks were a luxury Germany couldn't afford, but even Guderian admitted that the psychological impact of swimming tanks exceeded their tactical value, creating an impression of Allied invincibility that undermined German morale throughout the Normandy campaign and beyond. The story of Sergeant George Geddes, one of only 2 tank commanders from the 741st Tank Battalion to successfully swim to Omaha Beach, illustrates the human dimension of the DD tank story, as Geddes had to watch 27 of his fellow tanks sink around him, had to ignore the desperate calls for help over the radio, had to keep his own crew focused on reaching the beach while friends drowned in the channel, and then had to fight alone without the support of his battalion, his single tank. Facing the entire German defense, yet he pressed on, providing what fire support he could, earning a Silver Star for his actions that day. The British crews of the 13th/18th Royal Hussars, who successfully swam 31 tanks to Sword Beach, had a different experience. Reaching shore in formation, immediately engaging German strongpoints with coordinated fire, their months of training paying off as they transitioned from swimming to fighting in minutes, their success validating the entire DD concept despite the disasters elsewhere, and several of these tanks advanced inland with their screens still attached, ready to cross the Orne River if needed, showing the operational flexibility the DD system provided when everything worked as designed. At German Naval Headquarters in Paris, Kriegsmarine officers reviewed the D-Day battle with particular interest in the DD tanks, recognizing that these amphibious vehicles had bypassed the naval defensive strategy entirely, rendering irrelevant the minefields and obstacles designed to channel landing craft into kill zones, and Admiral Theodor Krank reportedly said the swimming tanks represented the end of conventional coastal defense, that if tanks could swim ashore independently, then the entire concept of defending beaches with fixed fortifications was obsolete, requiring a complete rethinking of German defensive strategy that there was no longer time to implement. The Wehrmacht's Technical Intelligence Branch, Fremd hier West, compiled detailed reports on DD tank capabilities based on captured examples and prisoner interrogations, learning about the training at Fritton Lake and Camp MacDivitt, the production of over 1,000 swimming tanks, the plans to use them for future river crossings, and these reports painted a picture of Allied industrial might and innovative capacity that was deeply troubling to German planners, showing an enemy that could conceive, develop, produce, and deploy revolutionary weapons in complete secrecy, capabilities Germany no longer possessed. The impact on individual German soldiers was profound, as evidenced by letters home that survived the war, with one young Wehrmacht private writing to his mother about seeing tanks rise from the sea like monsters from a nightmare, another describing the helplessness of watching these swimming tanks approach while machine gun fire bounced off their armor, and a third simply stating, "They have weapons we never dreamed of," letters that reveal how the DD Sherman shattered German soldiers' confidence in their leaders, their technology, and their chances of victory. By June 7th, the secret of the DD Sherman was blown, with German reconnaissance flights photographing tanks with collapsed screens still attached advancing inland, German intelligence compiling comprehensive reports on the technology, and German propaganda trying to minimize its importance. But the damage was done, the psychological impact achieved, the element of surprise exploited, and while DD tanks would continue to serve throughout the European campaign, never again would they achieve the shock effect of June 6th, when German defenders first witnessed the impossible sight of tanks swimming from the sea. The last German officer to comment officially on DD tanks during the war was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of OKW, who during his interrogation after Germany's surrender specifically mentioned the swimming Shermans as one of several Allied innovations that Germany failed to anticipate, admitting that German intelligence had been completely blind to this capability, that German technical experts had dismissed the possibility when theoretical discussions arose, and that the appearance of swimming tanks on D-Day had been a shock from which we never fully recovered. An admission that validates the strategic impact of Nicholas Strasser's canvas screen and rubber tubes. The numbers tell the tactical story. Of approximately 280 DD tanks scheduled to swim ashore on D-Day, roughly 170 successfully reached the beaches, a 60% success rate that seems disappointing until you consider that these tanks provided immediate fire support when infantry were most vulnerable, that their presence convinced German defenders they faced an technologically superior enemy, and that their psychological impact far exceeded their numbers, contributing to the establishment of 5 separate beachheads that would merge into the lodgment area from which the liberation of Western Europe would proceed. The legacy of the DD Sherman extends beyond D-Day, as these swimming tanks were used to cross the Rhine in March 1945, with improved techniques and calmer river conditions resulting in much higher success rates, and the concept influenced post-war amphibious vehicle development in multiple nations. Though modern amphibious armored vehicles use different technologies, the basic concept proven on D-Day, that tanks could swim ashore under their own power and immediately engage in combat, revolutionized amphibious warfare doctrine and remains relevant to military planning today. The German failure to anticipate the DD Sherman represents a larger intelligence failure that characterized the final years of the Third Reich. As Germany's spy networks had been compromised, its aerial reconnaissance was limited by Allied air superiority, its technical intelligence was hampered by arrogance and preconception, and its military leadership was increasingly isolated from reality, creating conditions where a secret as massive as converting 1,000 tanks to swim could be kept from German knowledge, allowing the Allies to achieve tactical surprise on the most important day of the war in Western Europe. In the final analysis, Germany never expected swimming Shermans to hit the beach because the concept violated everything German military doctrine taught about armored warfare, because German technical experts couldn't imagine making a 33-ton tank float with canvas and compressed air, because German intelligence failed to penetrate Allied security, and because German commanders were so confident in their Atlantic Wall defenses they couldn't conceive of tanks simply swimming around them. And this failure of imagination, more than any technical deficiency, explains why June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, when tanks that couldn't possibly swim emerged from the English Channel and helped establish the beachhead that would ultimately lead to Berlin. The story ends where it began, with Unteroffizier Klaus Hoffman of the 716th Static Infantry Division, who survived that first encounter with a swimming Sherman on Sword Beach, spent the rest of the war in a British prisoner of war camp where he learned the full story of the DD tanks, learned about Nicholas Strasser and his invention, learned about the training at Camp MacDivitt, learned about the 27 tanks that sank at Omaha, and in his memoir written decades after the war, Hoffman reflected that the moment he saw that first Sherman emerge from its collapsing canvas screen was the moment he knew Germany had lost the war, because an army that could make tanks swim could do anything, and against such an enemy, protected only by concrete and steel that suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate, the Third Reich never stood a chance.